The wind in Wyoming territory carried no mercy, only grit. It clawed at the loose planks of the Hastings barn and whispered through the cracked leather of Clara's gloves. She pulled the wire taut, her breath fogging in the chill of late autumn, her knuckles raw against the splintered fence post. Every twist of the wire was a small, sharp pain, a reminder of the 1,000 other pains that had settled into her bones over the last 2 years. This fence, like everything else on the ranch, was falling apart, and just like everything else, it was her burden to mend. The high plains stretched out around her, a vast, empty canvas of pale grass and gray sagebrush, shrinking under a sky that threatened an early snow. The ranch, once the 3rd largest in the county under her grandfather, was now just a shadow, clinging to life by the sheer stubbornness of her father, Jedediah. But Clara knew stubbornness didn't pay the bank in Cheyenne. Debt was a slower predator than the wolves that circled their meager herd, but it was far more certain. Clara Hastings was 26 years old. In the eyes of the world, her life was already over. She had been returned. That was the word they used, as if she were a faulty piece of mail-order machinery. Returned by her husband, Nathan Hale, for the singular, unforgivable crime of barrenness. She finished the splice and stood, rubbing her lower back. The cold seeped through her wool coat, but it was no match for the chill that lived inside her. She had failed, as a wife, as a woman. The town of Laram's Point had made its judgment, and the verdict was written in every averted gaze, every tight-lipped greeting she received at the Mercantile. Her father was waiting by the corral when she returned, his face etched with the same worry that lined the dry creek beds. "We need flour, Clara," he said, not meeting her eye. "And salt." Daniel took the last to the herd. Clara nodded. "A trip to town, a fresh serving of humiliation. I'll saddle Bess." "And Clara," Jedediah added, his voice rough. "Keep your head high. You're a Hastings." She wanted to tell him that the Hastings name was as mortgaged as the land. It held no currency against the whispers. Instead, she just nodded again and went to the stables. Laram's Point was huddled in a shallow valley, a single muddy street bookended by the saloon and the church. It was a town that held its secrets tight and its judgments high. As Clara tied Bess to the hitching post outside the general store, she could feel the curtains of the seamstress shop twitch. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, was already on the boardwalk, her lips pursed into a small, hard knot. Clara kept her eyes down, her gaze fixed on the worn planks beneath her boots. She gathered her skirts and stepped up, the smell of dust, cured tobacco, and coffee washing over her from the store's open door. "Morning, Clara," Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, mumbled, his attention already fixed on a ledger. He was a kind enough man, but even he could not entirely shield her. She gave him her list: flour, salt, lard, coffee. She counted the coins from her drawstring purse, hoping it would be enough. The silence in the store was heavy, broken only by the scrape of the scoop in the flour barrel. And then the bell above the door chimed, and the silence was shattered. "Henderson, I need those Winchester rounds I ordered, and Annabelle requires another bolt of that blue calico, the one from St. Louis." Clara froze. That voice, it was smooth, confident, and it wrapped around her spine like cold iron. Nathan Hale. She did not turn. She kept her back to him, praying he would not see her, that he would conduct his business and leave. She heard the soft rustle of skirts, a light, tinkling laugh. "Oh, Nathan, hush, Mr. Henderson doesn't need you bellowing." A sweet, feminine voice chided. "He does if I want to get back before noon." Clara heard Mr. Henderson clear his throat. "Good day, Mr. Hale, Mrs. Hale. I'll fetch those for you." Mrs. Hale. The word was a fresh wound. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, her fingernails digging into her palms. She could feel him standing behind her. She could feel his presence like a change in the weather, a pressure drop that promised lightning. "Well, now," Nathan said, his voice dropping into that familiar, mocking drawl. "Clara, it's been some time. You're looking strong. Ranch life must agree with you." She turned, slowly. She had promised her father she would hold her head high. Nathan Hale was as handsome as he'd ever been. His black coat tailored perfectly to his broad shoulders. His boots polished to a high shine. He owned the bank. He owned the livery. And he had, for a time, owned her. Beside him stood Annabelle, his new wife. She was barely 20, with bright blonde curls and a rosy complexion that spoke of a life without hardship. And she was, quite visibly, with a child. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her stomach, a proprietary, triumphant gesture. Clara's breath hitched. This was the living, breathing proof of her failure. "Nathan, Annabelle," Clara managed, her voice a dry rasp. "It's a shame about your father's finances," Nathan continued, ignoring the polite terror in his new wife's eyes. "I hear the bank in Cheyenne is calling in his markers. Perhaps he should have accepted my offer for the northern pasture." "My father's finances are his own," Clara said, her voice shaking despite her best effort. Of course," he smiled, a thin, cruel expression. "We all must live with the choices we make, and the families we build." He glanced pointedly at Annabelle's stomach, then back at Clara's flat abdomen, his gaze lingering with intentional cruelty. "You're at the ranch alone, I trust, aside from your father and the boy." It was a question meant to sting, to remind her that she would always be alone, that no other man would have her. Mrs. Gable, who had materialized by the pickle barrel, clucked her tongue. Such a tragedy, a woman's purpose. After all, some are just not blessed. The heat rose in Clara's face, a burning, agonizing shame. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to scream. She wanted to hit the smug, satisfied look off her ex-husband's face. She did none of those things. She turned back to the counter, her shoulders rigid. "Mr. Henderson, my supplies. Right here, Clara." He slid the flour sack and parcels toward her, his eyes full of a pity that was almost as bad as the scorn. She paid, her hands trembling so badly she dropped a coin. It rolled across the floor and stopped at the toe of Nathan's gleaming boot. He chuckled, a low, insulting sound, but did not bend to pick it up. Clara left it. She grabbed her parcels, her head high as she had promised, and walked out of the store, the bell chiming her retreat. She did not run until she had untied Bess and was around the corner, out of sight. There, she leaned against the rough brick of the assayer's office and let the tears come, hot and silent. She wept for the babies she had lost, for the love she thought she had, and for the woman she had become, a barren, broken thing, mocked in the general store of her own town. It was as she was wiping her face on her sleeve, trying to muster the will to ride home, that he appeared. He rode into town not like a man arriving, but like a man being pushed. His horse, a lean buckskin, walked with its head low, as tired as its rider. The man himself was in his early 30s, his frame solid but spare, as if he'd missed more meals than he'd eaten. He wore a dusty brown duster, a hat pulled low, and a beard that was more than scruff but less than a statement. He rode past her, his gaze sweeping the street, taking in the saloon, the sheriff's office, the livery. His eyes met Clara's for less than a second. It was the briefest of contacts, but it struck her. Most men looked at her with pity, curiosity, or contempt. This man's eyes were gray, flat, and utterly exhausted. He had looked at her, and through her, as if she were just another part of the landscape, another dusty building, and then he was past, riding toward the saloon. Clara watched him go, a strange knot in her stomach. There was a stillness to him, a dangerous sort of quiet. He looked, she thought, like a man who had nothing left to lose. He was, she recognized, running from something. It was a look she knew well. She saw it in her own mirror every morning. She mounted Bess and turned for home, pushing the image of Nathan and Annabelle from her mind, replacing it with the unsettling image of the stranger's gray, empty eyes. The storm that had been threatening all day broke with a vengeance as she reached the borders of the ranch. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled, driving a cold, sharp rain sideways. It was a flash flood sky. She spurred Bess on, her anxiety for the ranch overriding the sting of her humiliation. She was half a mile from the house when she saw him. Her younger brother, Daniel, was on the far side of Bitter Creek, which was no longer a creek but a roaring, muddy torrent. He was 17, with all the confidence and none of the sense that age provided. He was waving, shouting something she couldn't hear over the storm, pointing at a small group of cattle huddled on the rising banks. "Daniel, no!" she screamed. But the wind stole the words. He spurred his horse into the water. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The horse, a young gelding, immediately lost its footing in the churning, debris-filled water. It panicked, rearing, and Daniel was thrown. Clara screamed. She watched in horror as his head went under. He surfaced, gasping, his arms flailing, and was immediately swept downstream. "Daniel!" She kicked Bess into a run, galloping along the bank, her heart trying to hammer its way out of her chest. He was a strong swimmer, but the current was stronger. It was full of branches and silt, and the water was ice cold. He went under again. She was about to throw herself and Bess into the deadly water when a rider burst from the cottonwoods on her side of the bank. It was the stranger. He must have been cutting across their land, looking for shelter. He didn't hesitate. He didn't shout a question. He saw the boy in the water and the woman screaming on the bank. He drove his buckskin horse straight into the flood. It was a magnificent, terrible thing to watch. The horse was brave, fighting the current, the man leaning low over its neck, his eyes fixed on Daniel. The water was waist-deep on the horse, pushing them, turning them. The stranger fought it, his legs locked, guiding the horse with a strength that seemed impossible. He reached Daniel just as the boy was being pulled under for a third time, leaning dangerously far out of the saddle. The man grabbed a handful of Daniel's shirt. He hauled him up, half slung across the saddle, Daniel's head lolling, water streaming from his mouth. Now the stranger had to fight his way back. The horse, panicked and carrying double, stumbled. It went to its knees. Clara's heart stopped. The man roared, a raw, primal sound, and hauled the horse's head up by the reins. He kicked, he swore. He drove the animal through the last 10 feet of swirling, sucking mud and water until it collapsed on the bank, sides heaving. Clara was already off Bess, sliding in the mud, sobbing. Daniel was limp, his face a terrifying blue. "He's not breathing," she cried. The stranger was already off the horse, dragging Daniel onto a flatter patch of grass. He rolled him onto his stomach, hard, and pushed on his back. Water gushed from Daniel's mouth. The man pushed again, and again. He was brutal, efficient, focused. Daniel gave a choked, sputtering cough, then a desperate, ragged gasp. His eyes fluttered open, wide with terror. The stranger sat back on his heels, the rain plastering his dark hair to his skull. He was breathing almost as hard as the horse. He looked at Clara, his gray eyes no longer flat, but burning with a fierce, exhausted light. "He'll be cold," the man said, his voice a low gravel. "Get him to the house." He stood, helped Clara lift her brother, and all but threw Daniel onto Bess's back. He slapped the horse's rump. "Go, I'll get the horses." Clara mounted behind her brother, holding him upright, and galloped the last quarter-mile, her mind a blank whirl of terror and a strange, profound gratitude. By the time she and her father had stripped Daniel of his wet clothes and wrapped him in every blanket they owned, the stranger was at the door, his own horse and Daniel's gelding in tow. Jedediah Hastings opened the door, his face grim. "Come in, son, come in." The stranger stood on the porch, dripping water onto the boards. He was covered in mud, and he was shaking, though Clara couldn't tell if it was from cold or exertion. "The boy," the man said. "He's breathing," Clara whispered from the hallway. "He's alive. You saved him." The man nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. He seemed to shrink, the ferocious energy that had saved Daniel seeping away, leaving only the exhausted drifter. "You saved my son's life," Jedediah said, his voice thick. "I am in your debt. I don't have much, but what I have is yours. Food, a roof, a fire." The man looked up. "I'm looking for work." Jedediah stared at him. "The ranch is failing. I can't pay you much." $20 a month, plus your keep." The man was silent for a long moment. "My name is Levi Carson. I'll take it." "Done," Jed said, offering a hand. Levi took it. His grip was firm, his hand calloused. "Clara, get Mr. Carson some of my dry things. Put him in the spare room off the kitchen. It ain't much, but it's warm." Clara hurried to obey, her mind still reeling. She found her father's old woolen shirt and trousers, her hands shaking as she laid them out. She could still see Levi hauling Daniel from that water, the raw power of it. The next day, Sheriff Brody rode out. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet pine. Clara was hanging blankets on the line when he arrived. He tipped his hat to her, his expression somber, and went straight to Jedediah, who was examining the hooves on Levi's buckskin. Clara was too far away to hear, but she was close enough to see. She watched the sheriff talk, his thumb jerking back toward town. She watched her father's face harden. Jed shook his head, firmly. The sheriff argued, his hands gesturing. Jed shook his head again, then clapped Levi, who was standing silently by, on the shoulder. Sheriff Brody sighed, settling his hat back on his head. He mounted his horse, gave Clara a look of grim resignation, and rode off. Jedediah walked over to Clara, his boots sinking into the mud. "What did he want?" Clara asked. "He came to warn me about Levi Carson." Clara's stomach tightened. "Warn you?" "Said Levi's got history. Served 2 years in a prison down in Colorado." Clara looked toward the barn, where Levi had already started reinforcing the door that the wind had nearly torn from its hinges. He worked with a steady, fluid rhythm. "What did he do?" Brody wasn't clear. "Theft, he thought. Said he wasn't a man to be trusted. Told me to send him on his way, especially with—" Jedediah trailed off, but Clara knew what he meant. "Especially with an unmarried woman in the house." "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him that man rode into a flood to save my only son. I told him I don't care what he did in Colorado. He's earned his place here." Jed looked at his daughter, his eyes searching her face. "You'll be all right with that?" Clara thought of Nathan's polished boots and his cruel smile. She thought of the whispers in the store. Then she thought of Levi's face, brutal with effort as he pushed the water from Daniel's lungs. "Yes," she said. "I'll be all right." She was wary, though. A man with a prison record was dangerous. He was another shadow for the town to whisper about, another mark against the Hastings family, but as the days turned into a week, her wariness began to soften, replaced by a quiet intrigue. Levi Carson was a ghost. He rose before the sun and worked until long after it had set. The ranch, which had been overwhelming her and her father, began to yield to his relentless energy. He repaired the corral, rehung the barn door, split a mountain of firewood, and started mending the fences on the north pasture, all without a single word of complaint. He was the quietest man Clara had ever known. He ate his meals with them in the kitchen, his head bowed over his plate, and spoke only when spoken to. And when he did, his words were short, polite, and offered nothing of himself. Most importantly, he never stared. Clara was used to men's eyes, the pity from old family friends, the leering speculation from the saloon crowd, the cold, assessing disdain from Nathan. Levi's gaze, when it landed on her, was respectful and brief. He did not ask about her past. He did not ask why a woman her age was back on her father's ranch. He did not ask why she wore no wedding band, or why she flinched when her father's voice rose in anger at the cattle. He treated her not as a failed woman, but as another person. It was a courtesy so simple and so profound that it unnerved her. She found herself watching him from the kitchen window. She watched him chop wood. He moved with an economy of motion, the axe rising and falling in a powerful, hypnotic rhythm. There was no wasted energy, no wasted words. She watched him gentle the young gelding that had thrown Daniel, his voice a low, patient rumble, his hands firm and sure on the horse's neck. She had been right. That first day in town, there was a deep, buried sadness in him. She saw it when he thought no one was looking, when he'd stop his work and stare at the distant line of the mountains, his shoulders heavy, his face locked in a memory that was clearly painful. He was a man marked by loss, just as she was. One evening, she brought him a cup of coffee as he worked late in the barn, mending a broken harness by lantern light. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, taking it from her. His fingers brushed hers. His hand was rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. She lingered, pulling her shawl tighter. "You work too hard, Mr. Carson." He took a sip of the coffee, his eyes on the leather in his lap. "It's good land, deserves to be worked." "It's dying land," she said, the words slipping out, bitter and true. "My father he's losing it." Levi looked up. His gray eyes were clear in the lamplight. "Land doesn't die, ma'am. It just waits. I need a strong hand. That's all." He looked back at his work. A clear dismissal. Clara stood for another moment, the smell of hay and warm animals and his quiet strength filling the small space. She felt something she had not felt in 2 years. It was not hope. It was something smaller, more fragile. It was a curiosity. She left him to his work, walking back to the house under a brilliant spray of cold stars. The wind was rising again, and she knew the winter would be long, but for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel entirely alone. Winter arrived in Wyoming not with a whisper, but with the heavy, iron slam of a prison door. It was a sensation Levi Carson knew well. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, hanging low and oppressive over the Hastings Ranch, stripping the last of the autumn warmth from the air. The wind shifted, coming down from the north with a bite that froze water in the troughs within an hour of sunset. For the last 3 weeks, Levi had worked with a desperation that matched the turning season. He knew what winter did to a failing ranch. It sought out the weak spots, the rotted timber, the loose shingle, the hungry belly, and it tore them open. He spent his days securing the barn, reinforcing the stalls where the draft horses stamped against the cold, and splitting cord after cord of firewood until his palms were blistered and callus upon callus had formed. Clara was often there with him. She did not hide in the house like the porcelain dolls of the city women he had seen in Denver. She wore a heavy wool coat that had likely belonged to her brother once, and she carried logs, mended feed bags, and mixed mash. The silence between them, once a wall of wariness, had begun to thin. It was no longer a barrier, but a shared space where words were not always necessary. One afternoon, as Levi swung the splitting maul with a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence, his mind drifted back to the cold he could not escape, the cold of the stone cell in Colorado. 2 years. The judge had called it larceny. The sheriff had called it justice. Levi just called it necessary. He paused, resting the heavy iron head of the axe in the snow, his breath pluming before him. He could still see his sister's face, pale and waxy, lying in that boarding house bed. Mary had been 22, too young to die of consumption, too poor to afford a doctor, and certainly too proud to beg, but dying cost money, just as living did. When she passed, there was nothing for a box, nothing for a plot in the churchyard. The local gang boss, a man named Silas Vane who ran the gambling halls and the backroom vices, had plenty. Levi had taken $300 from Vane's personal safe. He had paid the undertaker, bought Mary a plot under a cottonwood tree, and stood by her grave for an hour before the deputies came. He had gone to prison without a fight because Mary was safe on the earth, and that was all that mattered. "You're thinking about something dark. Mr. Carson," Levi started, turning to see Clara standing near the woodpile, a basket of kindling in her arms. Her cheeks were flushed with the cold, her eyes bright and observant. "Just thinking, ma'am," Levi said. pulling his hat lower. Winter brings back old memories. Bad ones. Cold ones, he corrected gently. He lifted the maul again. Stand back, please. He split the log with a singular, violent crack. Clara did not flinch. She watched him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, as if she too knew what it was to be haunted by ghosts that refused to lie down. As the days grew shorter, the rhythm of the ranch shifted indoors during the long, pitch-black evenings. The kitchen became the heart of their world. The wood stove roared, casting a warm, flickering orange light over the table where Levi, Clara, Jedediah, and Daniel ate their supper. Daniel, fully recovered from his near drowning, had attached himself to Levi like a burr. The boy was eager, desperate for a man to show him the things his father, weakened by age and stress, could no longer manage. Pa says the wolves will be down from the high country soon, Daniel said one evening, pushing his stew around his plate. I need to be ready. I couldn't hit a barn door with the Winchester yesterday. Levi looked up from his coffee. A rifle is only as good as the man holding it. You are jerking the trigger. Daniel, you have to squeeze it, like you are shaking a hand you don't want to let go of. Daniel's eyes lit up. Will you show me? Tomorrow? Levi glanced at Jedediah. The old man nodded, a look of gratitude passing over his weathered face. Go on, Levi. Make him useful. The next morning, under a sky as white as a sheet, Levi took Daniel to the ridge behind the barn. He set up tin cans on fence posts and spent hours teaching the boy the geometry of death. He taught him to breathe, to wait for the heartbeat to settle, to respect the weapon not for what it could do, but for what it could take away. Clara watched from the kitchen window. She saw the way Levi knelt in the snow, his patience infinite. He did not shout when Daniel missed. He did not belittle him. He simply adjusted the boy's elbow, spoke a few low words, and waited for him to try again. When Daniel finally hit the can, sending it spinning into the air, Levi did not cheer. He just nodded, a small, approving gesture that seemed to make Daniel grow 2 inches taller in an instant. It was a kindness Nathan had never possessed. Nathan Hale had treated Daniel as a nuisance, a foolish boy to be ignored or mocked. Levi treated him like a man in the making. That evening, the temperature plummeted. The wind began to scream around the eaves of the house, rattling the window panes in their frames. Clara found Levi in the barn, checking the latches on the stallion's stall. The air inside smelled of sweet hay and warm horseflesh, a comforting contrast to the biting gale outside. Daniel won't stop talking about his aim, Clara said, stepping into the light of the lantern Levi had hung on a nail. You have a way with him, Levi shrugged, running a hand down the stallion's neck. He listens. That is rare in a young man. He admires you, Clara said softly. She moved closer, wrapping her shawl tight. He needs that, a man to look up to who isn't broken. Levi stopped his stroking. He turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. I am not whole. Clara, you know the sheriff's warning. You know I have seen the inside of a cage. I know you saved my brother, she countered, her voice firm. And I know you work harder than any man I have ever seen, for wages that are barely enough to buy tobacco. I don't smoke, Levi said simply. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind howling outside. It felt like the world had shrunk down to this circle of lantern light. Why do you stay? Clara asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. You could move on, find work in California or Texas. Why stay here, on a dying ranch with a family that has nothing to offer you? Levi looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. Maybe I am tired of running. Maybe I like the quiet. It's not quiet in town, Clara said bitterly. I saw the way you looked when we went to the general store last week. You heard them. You heard what they say about me. Levi did not look away. I heard small people talking about things they don't understand. The kindness in his voice broke something inside her. The dam she had built to hold back the shame, the grief, and the anger finally cracked. She took a step toward him, her hands trembling. "They call me Baron," she whispered. The word hung in the air, ugly and harsh. "Nathan, my husband, he wanted a dynasty. He wanted sons to carry his name. We were married for 3 years. She looked down at her hands, twisting the wool of her shawl. "I was with the child twice. The first time, I lost it in the 4th month. It just went away. The doctor said it happens." Nathan said nothing. He just looked at me like I had broken a vase. Levi stood motionless, listening with an intensity that made her heart race. "The second time," Clara continued, her voice barely audible over the wind. "It was late, almost 6 months. I fell on the ice, or maybe I didn't. Maybe it was just me. I woke up in pain, and there was blood. And then there was nothing, just a tiny, silent thing that never took a breath." She looked up at him, tears hot in her eyes. "Nathan told me I was defective. He said a ranch needs a woman who can breed, not a dry husk. He annulled the marriage. He sent me back here like a lame horse. And then he married Annabelle. And now she carries the child I could not give him." She waited for the pity. She waited for the awkward shifting of feet, the mumbled platitudes about God's will. Levi did not shift. He took a step closer, invading her space, his presence overwhelming. He reached out, not to touch her, but to rest his hand on the stall door beside her head, boxing her in with his strength. "You listen to me," Levi said, his voice low and rough as gravel. "A man who measures a woman by what she can give him is no man at all. He is a merchant. He is trading in flesh." Clara stared at him, her breath catching. "Losing a child," Levi said, his eyes locking onto hers, "is not a failure. Clara, it is a wound, and you do not blame the wounded for bleeding. You didn't deserve that. You didn't deserve any of it." He didn't offer false hope. He didn't tell her she would have children one day. He simply validated her pain. He took the weight of her failure and cast it aside as if it were nothing more than a lie told by a fool. Clara let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 2 years. "Thank you," she whispered. Levi nodded once, then stepped back, the moment breaking but the connection remaining, vibrating in the air between them. "Go inside. Clara, the storm is getting worse. I'll finish up here." She went back to the house, but she carried his words with her like a coal in her pocket, burning warm and bright against the cold. 3 days later, the blizzard struck in earnest. It began at noon with a sky that turned a terrified white, erasing the horizon. By 2 o'clock, the snow was falling so thick and fast that a man couldn't see his own hand at the end of his arm. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Clara was in the kitchen when she realized the back gate had been left unlatched by the wind. She peered out the window, squinting against the driving snow. Through a momentary break in the whiteout, she saw a small, dark shape stumbling near the creek line. It was the new calf, born out of season and fragile. It must have wandered out when the gate blew open. Panic seized her. That calf represented $20 at market. It was food. It was survival. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and scarf, wrapping them hastily around her head. "I'm just going to the creek," she called out to the empty room. Her father was asleep in his chair. Levi and Daniel were in the tack room. They wouldn't hear her. She stepped out onto the porch and was instantly blinded. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. She put her head down and pushed forward, guided only by memory and the desperate need to save the animal. She found the calf huddled in a drift of snow against a fallen cottonwood. It was shivering violently, too weak to stand. Clara fell to her knees, scooping the creature into her arms. It was heavier than it looked, dead weight in the deep snow. She turned to go back to the house, and realized she had no idea where the house was. The world was white, up, down, left, right. It was all a swirling, screaming vortex of snow. Her tracks had already been filled in. The barn, the house, the fences. Everything was gone. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her adrenaline. She shouted, but the wind tore the sound from her throat before it could travel 3 feet. She stumbled forward, clutching the calf, hoping she was moving towards safety. But after 10 minutes of trudging through knee-deep drifts, she realized she was lost. The cold began to seep through her coat, numbing her fingers, her toes. Her mind began to grow sluggish. She sank to her knees, the snow piling around her, the calf bawling weakly against her chest. "Clara!" The voice was a ghost in the wind. She didn't lift her head. It was the wind playing tricks. "Clara!" It was closer. A roar. A command. She looked up, her eyelashes frozen together. A dark shape loomed out of the whiteness. It was a monster. It was a mountain. It was Levi. He had a rope tied around his waist, the other end disappearing into the oblivion behind him, presumably tethered to the porch railing. He looked wild, his face covered in ice, his eyes frantic. When he saw her, he didn't speak. He lunged. He fell into the snow beside her, ripping the calf from her frozen arms and tucking it inside his massive duster coat. Then he grabbed her. He hauled her to her feet, his grip bruisingly hard. "Walk!" he screamed over the wind. "Move your feet!" "I can't," she gasped. "My legs." He didn't argue. He swept her up into his arms, holding her against his chest, the calf sandwiched between them. He turned and began to follow the rope back, hand over hand, fighting the wind that tried to knock them down with every step. It took an eternity. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the crushing cold and the steady, thunderous beat of Levi's heart against her ear. Then, warmth, a door slamming, the roar of the wind muffled to a dull thrum. She was on the rug in front of the fireplace. The fire was roaring. Levi was there, stripping her wet coat off, chafing her hands, his face pale with terror. "Clara, Clara, look at me!" She blinked, her vision swimming. The room was empty save for them. The house was silent. Her father and brother must have been in the other wing. Or perhaps the storm was so loud they hadn't heard the door. Levi had thrown his coat aside. The calf was wrapped in a blanket by the hearth, already sleeping. Levi was on his knees over her, rubbing warmth into her arms, her hands. "You foolish woman!" he rasped, his voice shaking. "You could have died. For a calf. You could have died." "I had to," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "We need the money." "To hell with the money," Levi roared, the anger sudden and explosive. "I can replace money. I can't replace you." The silence that followed his words was louder than the storm. Clara stopped shivering. She stared up at him, seeing the raw panic in his eyes, the way his hands were still gripping her shoulders as if he were afraid she would vanish if he let go. He froze, realizing what he had said. His hands relaxed, but he did not pull away. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as the ranch owner's daughter, but as the woman he had just carried through hell. The firelight danced on the walls, casting long, flickering shadows. The heat from the hearth began to penetrate their clothes. Clara felt a different kind of heat rising in her blood, a slow, aching throb that had nothing to do with the fire. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his face. His beard was rough, damp from the melted snow. His skin was cold, but burning underneath. "Levi," she breathed. He turned his face into her palm, closing his eyes. It was a gesture of such surrender that it stole her breath. He let out a long, ragged sigh. "I should go," he whispered, but he didn't move. "The boy, your father." "They are asleep," Clara said. "The storm is too loud." Levi opened his eyes. They were dark, dilated, full of a hunger he had kept leashed for weeks. He looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes. "Clara, I am a convict. I am a hired hand. I have nothing." "You have me," she said. "Right here. You have me." She sat up slowly, the distance between them vanishing. Levi's hand moved from her shoulder to her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was reverent, terrified, and desperate. "I have wanted to do this since the day I saw you crying in town," he murmured. He leaned in. It wasn't a sudden collision. It was a slow, inevitable gravitation. When his lips brushed hers, it was soft at first. A question. Clara answered it by leaning into him, her hands tangling in his damp shirt. The kiss deepened, becoming urgent. It tasted of wood smoke and snow and desperation. It was the kiss of two people who had been starving for a very long time. Levi groaned low in his throat, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her flush against him. There was no thought of the future, of the scandal, of the world outside the window. There was only the fire, the storm, and the man who had walked into the whiteout to bring her back. Clara held on to him, her heart hammering against his, knowing that for the first time in years, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The blizzard that had tried to take Clara's life ended up giving it back to her. The change was not sudden, like the breaking of a fever, but a slow, steady dawn after a long and starless night. The woman who had shuffled to the barn, her shoulders stooped under the weight of shame, was gone. In her place was a woman who walked with her chin high, who met her father's worried gaze with a steady reassurance, and who looked at the failing ranch not as a prison, but as a battlefield she had finally chosen to fight on. She worked with a new, focused energy. When she mended a fence, she pulled the wire taut with a snap of her wrists that spoke of decision. When she kneaded bread in the kitchen, her movements were firm, pounding life back into the dough, back into the house. She even laughed, a sound so rusty and unused that it startled Daniel into dropping a fork. He gaped at her, then broke into a wide grin. The kitchen, which had been a room of quiet suppers and unspoken anxieties, suddenly felt like a home. The source of this transformation was not lost on anyone. It was Levi Carson. He and Clara moved in a shared orbit, a silent understanding passing between them in the cold, clear air. They worked side by side, their hands often brushing as they passed tools or sacks of feed. A simple look from him was enough to bring a flush to her cheeks. A quiet word from her would stop the haunted look from settling in his eyes. He had pulled her from the snow, and in doing so, had anchored her to the earth. But Laram's Point was a town that fed on weakness and spat on change it did not understand. The whispers began the next time Clara and Levi rode to town for supplies. It was a necessary trip. The blizzard had depleted their stores, and Jedediah's credit, while thin, was not yet entirely gone. When Clara entered the general store, Mr. Henderson's gaze flickered to Levi, who stood just behind her, his hat in his hand, his eyes sweeping the room. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, was standing by the bolt goods, and she did not bother to lower her voice. "From the snow to the fire," she clucked to the woman beside her. "It's unseemly. A woman of her reputation, taking up with a hired hand. A convict, no less. Jedediah must be turning in his sleep. He ain't dead yet. Martha," the other woman replied. "But this might just kill him." Clara, who weeks before would have fled, turned. She walked directly to Mrs. Gable. Her face was calm, her voice clear and cold as creek water. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable. If you are quite finished discussing my reputation, perhaps you could move. You are blocking the sugar." The woman gaped, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. She turned a mottled red and scurried away without a word. Clara turned back to the counter, her heart hammering, but her hands were steady as she presented her list. Levi had not moved, but she could feel the heat of his presence at her back, a silent, solid wall of support. He had not interfered, had not spoken, but he had been there. That was enough. The victory was short-lived. As Levi carried the heavy flour sacks out to the wagon, the bell on the store door chimed. Clara was counting out the last of their coins when his shadow fell over her. "Well, Clara," Nathan Hale's voice was as smooth and cold as polished stone. "I see you've found a new stray." Clara did not look up. She pushed the coins toward Mr. Henderson. "That will be all. Thank you." "I am speaking to you," Nathan said, his voice hardening. He stepped closer, close enough for her to smell the bay rum on his skin. "Have you no shame at all? First, you fail as a wife, and now you sully your father's name by coupling with an illiterate field hand in his own barn." Clara's head snapped up. Her eyes blazed. "You will not speak of him that way. You will not speak to me at all." Nathan laughed, a low, cruel sound. "Or what? You'll have that criminal defend you? I hear he's good with his hands, but I doubt he can protect you from what you are. It's pathetic, really." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried through the entire silent store. "Tell me, Clara, does he know? Does your new man know he's planting seed in barren ground? Or are you letting him believe he might succeed where I failed? Mark my words, he'll leave you just the same. He'll leave you barren and alone. Again." The air left Clara's lungs. It was a precise, surgical strike, aimed at the deepest, most tender part of her. She had no defense, no words. She could only stand there, impaled on his cruelty. Levi was standing in the doorway. He had come back for the last parcel. He had heard every word. His face was a mask of such terrible, controlled fury that Clara felt a jolt of fear. His eyes were not gray, but black. His hand was clenched at his side, the knuckles white. He took one step into the room. His gaze locked on Nathan. Nathan, seeing the look, instinctively took a step back, his bravado faltering for just a second. "Levi, no." Clara's voice was a bare whisper. "Please, not here." Levi's gaze shifted to her. He saw her pale face, the naked pain in her eyes. He looked back at Nathan, his jaw working. The entire store held its breath, waiting for the violence that was coiled in his shoulders. Then, with an effort that seemed to cost him everything, he unclenched his hand. He walked past Nathan as if he were not there, picked up the last parcel of salt, and turned to Clara. His voice was quiet, devoid of all emotion. "It's time to go home, ma'am." Clara fled. She brushed past Nathan, her head high, and did not stop until she was on the wagon seat. Levi followed, his stride long and angry. He did not speak as he untied the reins. He did not speak as they left Laram's Point behind. The silence in the wagon was a cold, heavy thing, pressing down on Clara, extinguishing the small, new light inside her. He had heard the word barren, and he had retreated so far inside himself that she could no longer feel him. When they returned, Levi went straight to the barn, not to the house. He began splitting wood with a savage, desperate rhythm, the axe strokes falling like hammer blows. He was punishing the wood. He was punishing himself. Clara watched him from the kitchen window, her heart breaking. Nathan had won. He had poisoned the one good thing she had. Levi had heard the truth of her failure, and now he was pulling away. He would leave. Of course he would leave. Who would chain himself to a woman who was a walking reminder of death and emptiness? The tension on the ranch ratcheted tighter 2 days later. A fine, black carriage pulled up to the house just after noon. A man in a dark wool suit and a bowler hat stepped out. He was stout, with a gold watch chain stretched across his waistcoat and the unnervingly polite eyes of a predator. "Mr. Jedediah Hastings?" he inquired, ignoring Clara on the porch. "I am," Jedediah said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Silas Croft, from the Wyoming Land and Cattle Company in Cheyenne. I am here on behalf of several investors who are interested in your property." Jedediah stiffened. "It ain't for sale." "Everything is for sale. Mr. Hastings, for the right price," Croft said smoothly. He opened a leather satchel. "Your bank in Cheyenne holds notes on this ranch totaling nearly $3,000. They are due in 60 days. I am prepared, today, to offer you $4,000. Cash. Enough to clear your debts and give you a comfortable retirement. A fresh start." Clara's stomach turned to ice. $4,000. It was a fortune. It was an escape. Jedediah looked around. He looked at the sagging porch, at the barn with its patched roof, at the lean cattle huddled by the feed trough. He looked at Clara, his face etched with a profound, bone-deep weariness. "Let the man in, Clara," Jedediah said, his voice flat. "We'll hear what he has to say." Clara sat in the parlor, a room they never used, pouring coffee she was sure they couldn't spare, while Mr. Croft laid out the terms of their surrender. Levi, who had been summoned by Daniel, stood in the doorway, his face grim. He said nothing, but his presence was a silent judgment. Jedediah was listening. He was considering it. The pressure was unbearable. Her home, her land, the very ground beneath her feet, was being sold. And the man she loved, she admitted it to herself now, with a sharp, agonizing clarity, was a ghost, haunting the edges of her life, his heart sealed shut. That evening, after Mr. Croft had driven away, leaving the unsigned papers on the parlor table like a ticking bomb, Levi found her. She was standing by the corral, staring at the sunset, which bled a violent, bruised purple across the snow. "Saddle Bess," he said. It was not a request. "Where are we going?" "To check the northern pastures, the fence line." It was a flimsy excuse. The fences were fine, but she went without argument. She needed to escape the suffocating presence of that offer, of her father's indecision. They rode in silence, Levi's buckskin breaking trail through the light snow. He didn't take her to the north pasture. He took her high, up into the rocky hills that sheltered the ranch from the worst of the wind. He led her to a place she had not been since she was a child, a small, hidden grove of aspens surrounding a creek that ran clear and fast, kept from freezing by a deep spring. The air was sharp and clean, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the huff of the horses and the rush of the water. Levi dismounted and tethered the horses. He stood by the creek, his back to her. "He's going to sell it," Clara said, her voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. "My father, he's going to take the money." "Maybe he should," Levi said, his voice rough. "It would be an easier life for you." "Easier?" she cried, the word tearing out of her. "Easier to leave. Where to go where? To be what? There is nothing for me but this, and now there is nothing for me here." She slid from the saddle, her legs trembling. "You've barely spoken a word to me in 2 days, not since town, not since you heard what he said." Levi turned, his face a mask of pain. "Clara, what Nathan Hale said. It doesn't matter." "Don't!" she sobbed, the tears finally coming, hot and fast. "Don't lie to me. I saw your face. You heard him? Barren. That's what I am. A broken, empty thing. I am cursed. Levi, everything I touch, I ruin. My babies, my marriage, my father's ranch. And now you." She sank to her knees by the creek bed, the cold snow soaking through her trousers. But she didn't feel it. "Why did you ever stay? Why would you chain yourself to me? I can't give you a family. I can't give you sons. I can't give you anything but more hardship and more whispers. You should go. You should have left me in the snow." Levi crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. He knelt in the snow in front of her, grabbing her shoulders. He didn't lift her. He just held her, forcing her to look at him. "Stop it," he commanded, his voice raw. "You stop it right now. Do you think I care about that? About what that bastard said?" "It's the truth. It's a word," he roared. "It's just a word he uses to hurt you." He released her shoulders and cupped her face, his calloused, cold hands holding her as if she were made of glass. His thumbs wiped the tears from her cheeks. "I ain't scared of your past. Clara," he whispered, his voice shaking with an intensity that stunned her. "I ain't scared of his words, and I don't care about anyone's idea of family but ours." He searched her eyes, his own full of a desperate, pleading truth. "You talk about being broken. I'm the one who's broken. I'm the one who's been in a cage. I'm the one who came here with nothing but the clothes on my back and a past that would make a decent man run. And you looked at me. You didn't see a convict. You saw a man. You talk about what you can't give. You're the only person in 30 years who has given me a reason to be—" He was trembling. "He didn't poison me. Clara, he poisoned you. I haven't been pulling away because of what he said about you. I've been pulling away because he was right about me. I bring you shame. I bring you ruin. That's what I am. That's all I know how to do." "No," she whispered, her hands coming up to cover him. "You're wrong. You are everything to me." "Then stop listening to the ghosts," he murmured, "and stop believing I'm one of them." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss by the fire. This was a kiss of deep, agonizing, searching intensity. It was a vow. It was a prayer. He poured all of his loneliness, all of his pain, and all of his new, terrifying hope into it. Clara met him with equal force, her fingers digging into his arms, anchoring herself to him. It was a kiss that trembled with the sheer, raw weight of what it meant. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of apricot and lavender. Clara looked at him, her eyes clear of tears, full of a fierce, sudden decision. Her hands, still holding his, were trembling. Slowly, deliberately, she unbuttoned her heavy wool coat. She let it fall open. "Clara," Levi breathed, his voice thick. "It's cold. We should go back." "I am cold everywhere but here," she whispered. She unbuttoned the first button of her linen shirt. Her fingers were numb, fumbling. Levi's hand covered hers, stopping her. "What are you doing?" "I am tired of being afraid," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I am tired of being a barren woman, the broken wife. I want to be a woman. With you, here, now. I want to feel something other than cold and fear." His eyes searched hers, and what he saw there made his breath catch. It was not desire, not in the simple, cheap way he had known it. It was a profound, vulnerable, emotional need. It was trust. He stood, pulling her up with him. He led her into the sheltered grove of aspens, where the snow was thinner and the wind could not reach. He took the blanket roll from his saddle and spread it on the dry pine needles. He turned back to her. He did not touch her. He just waited, with her eyes locked on his. Clara slowly finished unbuttoning her shirt. She shrugged it from her shoulders, followed by her camisole. The freezing air hit her bare skin, and she gasped, but she did not stop. She stood before him in the fading light, her arms crossed over her chest, vulnerable and defiant. Levi's gaze was reverent. He saw the faint, silvery stretch marks on her belly, the pale scars of a life that had been hard on her. He saw her not as sterile, but as beautiful. He removed his own coat, his gloves, and his shirt. He showed her the pale, puckered scars on his back and side, the geography of his own brutal past. He was not just accepting her vulnerability. He was matching it. He stepped toward her and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his bare chest, skin to skin. Her gasp was sharp, but she melted against him, her body's cold meeting his warmth. He lowered her to the blanket, covering them both with his duster, creating a small, warm tent of shared breath and sudden, desperate heat. He made love to her with a raw, aching tenderness she had never known. It was not the practiced, selfish act she had endured with Nathan. It was a conversation. It was a discovery. Every touch was a question, every sigh an answer. It was emotional, vulnerable, and utterly real. She wept, not from sadness, but from a release so profound it felt like her soul was unknotting. And he held her, whispering her name against her hair, holding her as if she were the only real thing in a world of shadows. They rode back in the dark, the moon a bright, cold disk above them. They did not speak, but their hands brushed on the reins, and the silence was no longer empty. It was full. That night, Clara could not sleep. The small cot in her room felt like a cage. She rose, pulling on her thin wrapper, and padded barefoot down the hall to the small room off the kitchen where Levi slept. She opened the door without knocking. He was not asleep. He was sitting on the edge of his cot, his back to her, staring at the moonlight on the floor. "Levi," she whispered. He turned, his face etched in shadow. He saw her, and his whole body tensed, as if waiting for a blow, as if what had happened in the hills was a dream he was about to wake from. She crossed the small, cold room and sat beside him. She took his large, rough hand in both of hers. "I don't care," she said, her voice quiet but strong in the darkness. "I don't care if we never have children. I don't care if this ranch fails. I don't care what they say in town." She looked at him, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I just want to build something real, with someone who won't leave. With you." Levi looked at their joined hands. He felt the last of the ice around his heart crack and fall away. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "I won't leave," he said. It was the most important vow he had ever made. I'm not going anywhere. The high of the hidden creek, the warmth of Levi's promise, lasted less than a week. Reality, it turned out, was a predator that had only been waiting for them to show a moment's peace. The first blow came not from a man, but from the sky. A new storm, different from the blizzard, rolled in from the west. This was a storm of violent, relentless wind and freezing rain. A gale that sounded like a train passing constantly over the roof of the house. For 2 days, they were prisoners, the world outside a screaming, gray misery. On the second night, the sound came. It was not the howl of the wind, but a deeper, more terrible noise, the groan of ancient timber giving way, a sharp, splintering crack, and then a prolonged, crashing roar that shook the very foundation of the house. Levi was out of his small room before Clara had her hand on her own door. They met in the kitchen, their eyes wide in the dark. "The barn," Levi said, his voice a low, hard nod. He was already pulling on his boots, grabbing his duster. "You can't go out in that," Clara cried. "The horses." He didn't wait. He lit a lantern, tied a rope to the porch rail as he had in the blizzard, and plunged into the maelstrom. Clara, Daniel, and even Jedediah, who was now awake and pale, waited by the back door, the wind and rain lashing the kitchen floor. It was an eternity. When Levi returned, he was half carrying a bleeding, terrified Daniel. "What happened?" Clara screamed, rushing forward. "The boy followed me," Levi grunted. Setting Daniel down, the boy's arm was cut, but he was more scared than hurt. "The main support beam. It's gone. The whole north wall is down. The roof collapsed on the stalls." "The horses," Jedediah whispered, his hand on the doorframe. "I got the buckskin and Bess out," Levi said, his breath heaving. "The gelding, he's trapped. I couldn't—" Clara's hand flew to her mouth, but the worst was yet to come. When the storm broke at dawn, the full scope of the disaster was laid bare. The barn was a splintered ruin, a grave of timber and snow, but it was the sight in the north pasture that broke Jedediah's spirit. The storm had driven the last of their meager herd into a high-walled drift. The freezing rain had coated them in ice, and the wind had done the rest. A dozen cattle, their best breeding stock, were frozen statues in the snow, dead on their feet. It was more than a loss. It was the end. Clara found her father in the parlor 2 hours later. He was sitting at the small secretary desk, the unsigned papers from Silas Croft spread out before him, a pen in his hand. "Father, no," Clara said, her voice quiet. "We can rebuild. Levi and I, we can—" "With what, Clara?" Jedediah's voice was a dry, old rattle. "With what money? With what strength? I am 63 years old. I have buried a wife. I have buried my pride. I will not bury my children." He picked up the pen. "Croft's offer is fair. It's more than fair. It's an escape." "This is our home. We don't run." "I am not running," Jedediah said, his voice rising, his face turning a dark, alarming red. I am saving you." His voice slurred. The pen dropped from his fingers, spattering ink on the papers. He slumped forward, his hand clutching his chest, his eyes wide with a terrible, silent surprise. "Father!" Clara screamed. He fell from the chair before she could reach him. A dead weight, his body convulsing once before lying still. "Levi! Daniel! Help me!" Levi was there in a second. He took one look at Jedediah, at his slack-jawed, blue-lipped face, and gently pushed Clara aside. He lifted the old man as if he were a child and carried him to his bed. The doctor from Larham's Point took 6 hours to arrive, his face grim from the ride. He spent 10 minutes in the bedroom and came out shaking his head. "It's a stroke," he said, accepting the coffee Clara offered with a trembling hand. "A massive one. I've done what I can, but—" "But what?" Clara demanded, her voice flat. "He's alive, Clara, but the man you knew, he's gone. He'll not walk again. He may not speak. He will need constant care. I'm sorry." Clara stood frozen in the parlor, staring at the ink-spattered papers. Her father was in his bed, a living ghost. The barn was gone. The cattle were dead. Daniel was in the kitchen. his head on the table, sobbing like a child, which he was, and she was alone. Levi stepped up behind her. He did not touch her. He just stood there, a solid presence. "I'll start in the barn," he said quietly. "We can salvage some of the timber, and I'll need to take care of the herd and the gelding." Clara closed her eyes. He was talking about burying her horse, her cattle, her life. She nodded, unable to speak. She was in charge. The thought was terrifying. She was the head of a failing ranch, the nurse to an invalid father, and the mother to a grieving brother. The world had shrunk to the four walls of this house, and the weight of it was on her. No, she realized, not just on her. Levi was still there. He had not run. He was already planning, working. "Levi," she whispered. He turned. "Thank you." He just nodded and went to find his shovel. They were vulnerable, and the wolves of the world could smell it. Nathan Hale did not wait a week. He arrived 4 days after Jedediah's stroke, not on horseback, but in a smart, black buggy, accompanied by a man in a city suit who looked just as cold and polished as Silas Croft. Clara met them on the porch. She had forbidden Levi from coming. He was in the ruined barn, his fury a palpable thing, but he was obeying her. For now. "Clara." "A tragedy. What's happened?" Nathan said, his voice dripping with a sympathy that was more insulting than his scorn. "Your father's health, the barn. It's a terrible burden for a woman alone." "I am not alone," Clara said, her voice hard. She crossed her arms. "What do you want? Nathan?" "This is Mr. Hemlock," Nathan said, gesturing to the lawyer. "He's from our firm in Cheyenne. He's here to clarify a few things regarding ownership." "Clarify?" The lawyer stepped forward, all false smiles and cold eyes. "Mrs. Hastings, or is it Miss Hastings?" "That is precisely the issue. It seems your father's original deed, the one filed in 71, listed you as a co-inheritor with him on your grandfather's passing. You were, at that time, Mrs. Nathan Hale." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Nathan said, his smile thin and triumphant, "that your annulment, which you pursued with such vigor, was based on a lie. Infertility is not, it seems, grounds for a legal dissolution of property rights. You were my wife when you inherited this land. That makes half of this land my property." Clara stared at him, uncomprehending. "You're lying. The annulment. It was filed. It was filed," Hemlock agreed, "but never finalized. An administrative gap. One you, in your haste to be shed of your husband, overlooked. Mr. Hale is still, in the eyes of the law, tied to this property. He is, in essence, your partner. It's a lie. A lie we are prepared to take to a judge," Nathan said. He stepped closer. "Or we could settle this. I am a reasonable man. I know you are in debt. The bank, Mr. Croft, they're circling. I am prepared to buy your half for a very generous sum, enough to set you and your broken father up in a small room in town." It was then he saw him. Levi had emerged from the barn, a framing hammer in his hand. He was covered in sweat and sawdust, and his face was black with rage. Nathan's smooth mask slipped. His eyes narrowed, and a slow, ugly flush crept up his neck. "Or perhaps," he sneered, his gaze flicking between Clara and Levi, "you have other assets you're liquidating. You've replaced me with this, a common, filthy field hand? My God, Clara, you have fallen far." "Get off my land," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "It's our land, my dear," Nathan smiled. "And I'll be back, with the sheriff, unless you decide to take my offer. You have 1 week." He turned and got in his buggy. Levi didn't move until the buggy was a black speck on the horizon. He walked to the porch, his movements stiff. He did not look at Clara. He looked at the hammer in his hand, then threw it. It spun end over end, striking the porch post with a thunk that made Clara jump. Levi, she said. He's lying. It's a trick. Is it? Levi's voice was a low growl. Or is he just a better player? He's got you in a legal cage. Clara, and he's using me as the bait. What are you talking about? He's furious. He doesn't want the land, not really. He wants to win. He wants to punish you. And seeing me here, a man like that can't stand it. He'll burn this place to the ground just to make sure I don't have it. And I'll give him the matches. No, she said. We'll fight him. Levi just shook his head and walked back to the wreckage of the barn. His shoulders slumped. He was right. He rode to town 2 days later for supplies. Clara begged him not to. Don't go. Levi, not now. Let Daniel go. Daniel can't, Levi said, his voice flat. He's needed here to turn your father. I'll be back. But he was looking for a fight. He found it. Clara got the story later from Mr. Henderson, who rode out by himself, was too agitated to wait. Levi had been at the Mercantile, his back to the door, when Nathan and 2 of his friends from the bank walked in. Nathan, full of confidence and malice, had made a comment. Smell that? It's the scent of failure, and convict sweat. Levi, Henderson said, had not said a word. He had turned, slow and deliberate. He had walked to Nathan. He hadn't thrown a punch. It was worse. He had grabbed Nathan by his fine wool coat, lifting him half off the floor, and slammed him against the wall, scattering a display of canned peaches. He had been silent, his face a mask of cold. Terrifying promise. You will not touch her, Levi had whispered, his voice so quiet only Nathan could hear it, but the force of it silenced the store. You will not touch this land. You will not come back, or I will, and I will finish this. The sheriff had arrived, his gun drawn. Carson, I warned you, Brody shouted. Let him go. Let him go, or so help me God. I will put you back in that cell myself and throw away the key. Levi had held Nathan for 1 second longer, his eyes burning into the other man's, before he opened his hand and let Nathan drop to the floor in a heap of his own fine clothes. Levi had turned, straightened his duster, and walked out of the store. He rode back to the ranch, but the man who returned was not the one who had left. The fire was gone. In its place was a cold, dead ash. He retreated so far into himself that Clara felt she was living with a ghost again. He worked. My God, how he worked. He was a machine, clearing the barn, salvaging timber, digging graves for the cattle. He worked from before sunup until long after dark. Until he was so exhausted he would fall onto his cot in the barn. He refused to sleep in the house and not move. He wouldn't eat with them. He avoided her eyes. When she brought him his plate, he would take it with a mumbled, "Ma'am," and turn away. She cornered him by the new woodpile, the moon high and cold, painting the snow blue. Levi, talk to me, please. What are you doing? He didn't stop his work, swinging the axe in the cold, clear light. He's right. What? Nathan, he's right. Thud. I'm the weapon he's using against you. Thud. I'm a convict. I put my hands on him in town. Brody is just waiting for me to break. You were defending me! I was being a fool, he roared, slamming the axe into the chopping block. He turned to her, his face haggard. Don't you see, Clara? I told you, I bring ruin. I'm not helping you. As long as I am here, Nathan has a target. He has a reason. He'll use my past, my anger. He'll use me to take this ranch from you. He'll have the law on his side, and I'll be the animal in the cage he can point to. I'm not saving you. I'm costing you everything. That is not true. I need you. No, he said, his voice breaking. You need a lawyer. You need a miracle. You don't need a convict who can't keep his hands to himself. I'm poison, Clara, and he's using me to kill this place. He picked up the axe and turned his back on her. The conversation, in his mind, over. She stood there, frozen, as the steady, rhythmic thud of the axe echoed in the frozen night, each blowing a nail in the coffin of the hope they had built. She knew, with a certainty that settled in her stomach like a cold stone, what he would do. She woke before the sun, a sliver of gray light on the horizon. The house was silent, save for the labored breathing of her father down the hall. Levi's cot in the kitchen was empty, the blanket folded. She didn't bother with a coat. She ran, her bare feet slipping in the snow, her thin nightdress whipping around her legs. She ran to the barn. He was there. The buckskin was saddled, his small bedroll tied neatly behind the cantle. He was checking the cinch, his back to her, a dark silhouette against the pale dawn. "You're leaving." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, of profound, hollow-ringing betrayal. He froze, his hand on the saddle. He did not turn. "It's the only way. Clara, if I'm gone, he has no leverage. He has no target. He'll have to deal with you. He'll settle for money. He won't have a reason to burn it all down. So you run." "I'm not running," he said, his voice rough. I'm saving you, the only way I know how." He finally turned, and his face, in the gray light, was a roadmap of agony. "Please, let me go." He tried to move past her, to swing into the saddle. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. The time for tears was over. This was a fight. She blocked his path, standing between him and the horse. "No. Clara, get out of the way. Don't make this harder." "No." She grabbed the front of his duster, her fists bunching the thick material. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to ride in here, a conquering hero. You don't get to save my brother, and save me. You don't get to make me believe in something again. You don't get to make love to me in the hills, and then run like a coward the moment it gets hard." He flinched as if she had struck him. "I'm not—" "You are. You are running. You are abandoning me. That's what Nathan did. He left when it was hard. He left when I failed him. Are you him? Are you just another man who leaves?" "Stop it," he yelled, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders. "I am not him." "Then prove it," she screamed back, her face inches from his. Stay and fight. I am not that weak woman you found in the snow. Levi, I am not the woman who hides in the general store. You did that. You helped build this woman, so you don't get to tear her down." She was weeping now, hot, angry tears that froze on her cheeks. "I am fighting, Levi. I am fighting for my father, who is dying in that bed. I am fighting for my brother, who is crying in the kitchen. I am fighting for this land. And I am fighting for you, but I cannot do it alone." She didn't let go of his coat. She just held on, her body shaking with cold and fury. Her gaze locked on his. He stared at her, his own face cracking. The walls he had built, the cold ash, the distance. It all crumbled. He saw her, not a victim, not a burden. He saw a warrior. His hands on her shoulders gentled. He pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her, crushing her against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, his own body trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered, over and over. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." He unfastened his bedroll and threw it to the ground. He unsaddled the horse. He did it all with one arm, his other never letting her go. That night, the tension was still in the house, a low, electric hum. He had not left, but the battle was not over. Clara nursed her father, cooked supper for Daniel, and moved through the chores of her life with a grim, steady purpose. When the house was dark, when her father's breathing was deep and rhythmic, she went to the kitchen. Levi was not on his cot. He was sitting at the table, his head in his hands, defeated. She did not say a word. She took his hand. He looked up, his eyes hollow. She pulled him gently. "Come." "Where?" "To bed." She led him not to his small, cold cot, but to her room, her sanctuary. The room she had never shared with anyone, not even Nathan. She lit a single candle. The room was small, clean, and smelled of her, of soap and dried lavender. He stood in the middle of the room, looking lost, a bull in a china shop. "Clara, I can't, not here. Last week," she said, her voice low. "I asked you not to be reckless. I asked for gentleness. I was afraid." She stood in front of him and, with slow, deliberate movements, unbuttoned her flannel nightdress. It pooled at her feet. She stood before him in the candlelight, her body pale, strong, and marked by her life. "I am not afraid any more, and I was wrong." She took his hand and placed it on her heart. "I don't want gentleness tonight. Levi, I don't want the man who holds back, the man who is afraid of breaking me, the man who is afraid of his own past. I don't want the man who walks away." She looked up at him, her gaze fierce and unwavering. "I want the man who rode into the flood. I want the man who carried me through the blizzard. I want the man who threw Nathan Hale against a wall. I want all of you, the anger, the fear, the strength, the part of you that wants to fight. I want all of it, because I need all of it. We need all of it if we are going to win." He didn't move for a full second, and then he did. His hand moved from her heart to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. He pulled her to him, and his kiss was not gentle. It was not tender. It was a desperate, hungry, furious claim. It was a promise, an oath, a surrender. It was the kiss of two people standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into the abyss, and deciding to build a bridge instead of jump. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed. In the small, dark room, they held on to each other, a desperate, defiant hope against the coming dawn. The night in Clara's room had been a declaration of war. The act of love was not a surrender, but a claiming of the only ground they truly owned, each other. In the gray, cold light of morning, the problems had not vanished. They had multiplied, but they were no longer Clara's problems, or Levi's. They were their problems. The fight had a new, shared center. The parlor became their war room. Jedediah's stroke had left him a silent, paralyzed audience in his bedroom down the hall, his labored breathing a constant reminder of the stakes. Daniel, sobered by the twin catastrophes, had aged a year and a week. He became their legs, their hands, while Clara and Levi became the mind. They began the long, agonizing battle to keep the land. Nathan's claim was a poisoned arrow. His lawyer, Hemlock, had been precise. The annulment was flawed, the inheritance muddled by his name on her legal title as a married woman. "He's wrong," Clara insisted, her hands sifting through a wooden chest of her father's papers. The smell of dust and old leather filled the room. "The annulment was final. I have to have a copy." But where? Levi, who could read a man or a horse in a single glance, was lost in this world of foolscap and ink. He sat with her, night after night by candlelight, his presence a solid, unmovable object in the room. He turned pages. He held candles. He listened as she read aloud. "This is a tax receipt from 1870. This is a bill of sale for a bull." They were searching for a single piece of paper, a legal ghost, in a blizzard of farm history. The bank in Cheyenne was a real, looming threat. The 60 days Mr. Croft had mentioned were ticking down, but Nathan's claim was the immediate, venomous one. If he was her legal partner, he could force the sale to Croft, take his half, and leave her with nothing but her father's debt. They worked with a grim, focused intensity. Levi and Daniel salvaged what timber they could from the ruined barn. They built a 3-sided lean-to against the south wall of the house, a desperate temporary refuge for Bess and the buckskin. Clara, meanwhile, did the work of 3. She nursed her father. A slow, heartbreaking routine of broth, cleaning, and turning him to prevent sores. She cooked, she mended, and she fought the legal battle. Her nights spent writing letters to the territorial court in Cheyenne, begging for a copy of her annulment. Her hands cramping, her eyes burning. She was running on something colder than coal, stronger than adrenaline. She was running on pure, uncut rage, and it was burning her out. The illness began not with a bang, but with a creeping chill. At first, she blamed the drafts in the house, the long hours in the cold parlor, the snow she waded through to the lean-to. A cough settled in her chest, a dry, hacking sound that echoed in the quiet house at night. "You need to rest," Levi told her, his hand on her shoulder as she stood over the stove, stirring a thin porridge for her father. "Let me do that. Rest," she said, the word sounding foreign. If I rest, Nathan wins. If I rest, the bank wins. I will rest when this is over. You will rest now, or you will fall. He took the spoon from her hand. His voice was not unkind, but it was absolute. Go, sit by the fire. For 1 hour. She obeyed, but the rest was no rest at all. Her mind raced. The cough deepened, settling in her lungs. A painful, hot weight. She started to become dizzy. The words on the pages in front of her began to swim. The collapse came on a Tuesday. She had gone out with Levi to the woodpile. The air was sharp, clear, and deceptive. She felt a wave of nausea, a sudden, suffocating weakness. The world, which had been so sharp and bright, turned to a watery gray. Levi, she whispered. The word had no sound. She saw the axe fall from his hand. She saw his mouth open in a shout, but she did not feel the ground. The snow simply rose up and took her. When she woke, the world was a blur of fire and ice. She was in her bed. The fire in her fireplace was roaring, a furnace, but she was freezing, her body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable chill that rattled her teeth in her skull. Levi was there, his face a pale, terrified mask. He piled blankets on her. Then the fire came. The cold vanished, replaced by a heat so intense she thought she would ignite. She tore the blankets off, her skin burning. Levi was there, his hands, calloused and rough, surprisingly gentle as he laid a cold, wet cloth on her forehead. Fever, she heard him murmur. Damn it, Clara, a lung fever. He was terrified. She could see it in his eyes. This was not a blizzard he could fight, or a man he could face down. This was an enemy inside her, invisible and merciless. He had no weapons. He was a man of action, of muscle and will, and he was utterly, agonizingly, powerless. He did not leave her side. For 3 days, the world shrank to the 4 walls of her bedroom. He became her anchor in a sea of delirium. He forced water and thin broth between her cracked lips. He held her hand when the coughing fits took her, spasms so violent they threatened to break her ribs, leaving her breathless and weeping. He changed the linens when the fever sweat soaked them. He sat in the chair by her bed, his head bowed, just listening to the ragged sound of her breathing, a sentinel at the gates, refusing to let death enter. Daniel was a ghost, his young face crumpled in terror. He was the one who had to care for their father, a task he was wholly unprepared for. He would appear at Clara's door, his eyes wide. Levi, I don't know what to do. He won't eat. Warm the broth, just a little, Levi would rasp, never taking his eyes from Clara. And be patient. Now go. On the 3rd day, Daniel had to drive to town for more flour, more lamp oil. He was gone, and Levi was alone with the 2 invalids. It was in the general store that the boy finally broke. Mr. Henderson saw him, leaning against the flour barrels, his shoulders shaking. Daniel, what is it? Son? The story came out in a torrent of sobs. His father, paralyzed, the barn, gone, Nathan Hale, suing them. And now Clara was dying. The lung fever. And Levi wouldn't sleep. He was just waiting. Laram's Point, which had feasted on Hastings's failure, was now presented with a different story. A story of a convict's unyielding devotion, of a family's desperate, impossible fight. The help, when it came, was not a grand gesture. It was a series of quiet, unpleasant capitulations. Mr. Henderson was the first. He packed Daniel's supplies, but he added things to the box that weren't on the list. A thick slab of bacon, a jar of horehound candy for the cough, a bottle of expensive, medicinal brandy. This is for the fever, he said gruffly, pushing the box at Daniel. You tell that. You tell Mr. Carson. It's for the fever. The next evening, there was a knock on the back door. Levi, his face hollowed by exhaustion, opened it. There was no one there. On the porch, steaming in the cold, was a heavy iron pot of venison stew. He looked out into the dusk and saw a figure in a heavy shawl hurrying away, disappearing into the twilight. It was the shape of Mrs. Gable. Even Sheriff Brody rode out. Levi saw him coming, and his hand instinctively went to the axe handle. Brody stopped his horse a dozen yards from the porch. He did not dismount. "Carson, Sheriff!" Brody just stared at the man on the porch. Levi was a wreck. His clothes were rumpled, his face covered in a 3-day-old beard, his eyes red-rimmed and fierce. He looked more like a cornered wolf than a man. Brody cleared his throat. He unstrapped a sack from the back of his saddle. "Oats," he said. "Your horses look thin." He dropped the sack in the snow. Town's taking up a collection for Hastings, for the doctor." He looked at Levi again. A long, assessing look. "You look like hell. Son?" "She's sick," Levi said, as if that explained everything. "I can see that." Brody nodded once, a gesture of new, grudging respect. He turned his horse. "You send the boy if you need the doctor. I'll make sure he gets here." He rode away. Levi stood on the porch for a long minute, staring at the sack of oats. He did not feel victory. He felt a crack in the wall. The fever broke that night. It did not fade gently. It shattered. Clara woke from a nightmare, drenched in a cold sweat, her body screaming with a new, profound weakness. She was not hot. She was just empty. "Levi?" she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. He was beside her in an instant, his hand on her forehead. His own head dropped, his shoulders shaking with a silent, racking relief. He wasn't praying. He was just breathing. She's weak, Levi," Daniel said from the doorway. "She's so weak." Panic set in. The fever was gone, but the woman was a ghost. Levi, terrified that she would just slip away, made a decision. "Daniel, ride now. Get the doctor. Don't stop. Don't come back without him." Daniel, grateful for a mission, for anything but the helpless waiting, was gone in 10 minutes. It was 2 days before he returned. The doctor in tow, both men half frozen. By then, it was too late. Not for Clara, but for the doctor to do anything but state the obvious. Dr. Mayhew, a small, pragmatic man, examined Clara. He listened to her chest. He looked at her tongue. He took the cup of broth Levi offered. He looked at Levi, then at Clara, who was sleeping. A true, healing sleep. "I don't know what you did, Mr. Carson," he said, pulling his gloves back on. "She has lung fever. Bad, by all rights. Well, she should be in a pine box." He looked around the small, clean room, at the empty broth bowls, the neatly folded compresses, the way the fire was banked just so. "She's a fighter, this one, but she had help." He nodded at Levi. "Keep doing what you're doing. She's weak as a kitten, but she will live. It seems she has a profound reason to—" The doctor left, but his words hung in the air. She would live. Levi sat by the bed, his first moment of peace in a week. He watched her sleep. He let his own eyes close. He woke to the sound of a horse and buggy. It was Nathan Hale. He arrived on a brilliant, cold afternoon, the sun gleaming on the snow, mocking the sickness and poverty of the ranch. He was in his fine, black coat, his boots polished, his face smooth. He was here to see the end of his enemy. Levi met him on the porch. He was not the exhausted, terrified nurse. He was the man who had slept in a prison cell for 2 years. He was cold, quiet, and absolutely lethal. "Get off this land, Nathan. I'm here to see my partner," Nathan sneered, his gaze sweeping the dilapidated porch, noting the empty stew pot. "I heard she's ill. I've come to express my sympathies and to make my final offer before the bank takes this all, and you are left with nothing but a dying woman." The world turned red for Levi. He didn't think so. He didn't plan. He was just an instrument of a rage so pure it was almost holy. He crossed the porch in one step. He didn't punch him. He grabbed him, a handful of that fine wool coat, and dragged him off the porch, throwing him into the hard-packed, icy snow. Nathan gasped, the air knocked from his lungs. You convict! You'll hang for this!" "Not before you," Levi growled. He fell on him, his knees pinning Nathan's arms. His hands, those hands that had so gently bathed Clara's face, closed around Nathan's throat. He felt the man's pulse hammer in his neck, felt the cartilage give. He was back in the prison yard. He was back in that bar in Colorado. He was a killer, and he was going to kill this man. Levi, stop! The voice was a thread, a bare whisper, carried in the cold air. Levi froze. His hands did not release, but his pressure did. He turned his head. Clara was standing in the doorway. She was a vision from the grave. She was wrapped in her thickest wool blanket, her feet bare in the snow on the porch. Her hair was a matted, wild tangle. Her face was a waxy, skeletal white. She was holding herself up by the doorframe, her body shaking so hard he could see it from 10 feet away. But her eyes were not the eyes of a dying woman. They were on fire. Levi let go of Nathan. He scrambled to his feet, moving to her side. Clara, no, go back inside. You'll die. She put a frail, trembling hand on his chest. No. Nathan was on his hands and knees, gasping, coughing, his face a mottled purple. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. You're... Clara took one, shuffling step forward onto the porch. She looked down at the man who had been her husband, the man who had discarded her. You came here, she rasped, her voice rough as a corn shuck. You came to see me die? I... Nathan scrambled to his feet, trying to brush the snow from his coat, trying to regain his dignity. I came to make a final, generous offer, out of... respect. Respect? A cough tore through her, a racking spasm that bent her double. Levi's arm was around her instantly, holding her up. She waved him off, straightening, her eyes still locked on Nathan. You are a small, cold man. Nathan Hale. She panted, her voice gaining a terrible, weak strength. You think love is about sons, about land, about winning. She leaned on the porch rail, gathering her last bit of strength. She looked at Levi, who stood beside her, his face a mask of love and terror, his hand hovering, ready to catch her. Then she looked back at Nathan. I would rather die, this minute, broken and barren and poor, beside someone who would carry me through a storm. She took a deep, ragged breath. Then live 100 years, in a warm house, with a man like you, who is the storm. The words hung in the frozen air. It was a complete and total evisceration. Nathan Hale had no reply. He, the banker, the orator, the powerful man, was speechless. He had been beaten, not by the convict's fists, but by the dying woman's words. He looked at her frail, shaking body, and at the man who stood beside her, a solid, unmovable wall. He saw, in that moment, a bond he could not buy, he could not break, and he could not understand. His humiliation was absolute. He stared, his face flushing from purple to red, his mouth working. He turned, stumbled to his fine buggy, climbed in with shaking hands, and fled. He did not look back. The moment he was gone, Clara's strength vanished. She sagged, her eyes rolling back. Levi. He was there. He caught her, lifting her as if she weighed less than a child. The blanket falling away. He carried her back into the house, back to her bed, his heart hammering with a terror greater than any he had felt for his own life. She had not died. She had fought. Her recovery was slow, measured in sips of broth, in hours of sleep. But the fever was gone. The poison was gone. From Nathan, and from her. Levi sat with her, not as a nurse, but as a partner. The legal papers were still on the table in the parlor. The debt was still due. The world was still hard. He'll be back, she whispered one evening, her voice stronger. She was sitting by the fire, wrapped in blankets. No, Levi said, his hand covering hers on the arm of the chair. He won't. He lost. We still have to fight the bank. We still have to find that paper. But him, he's done. "How do we fight, Levi? I have no strength left." "I have enough for both of us," he said. "You fought the fever. You fought him. Now you rest. I'll do the work. We'll find a way. We stay. We fight." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. The winter still howled outside, but it could not get in. The house was small. The ranch was failing. But for the first time in her life, she felt utterly, completely safe. Jedediah Hastings died on a Tuesday, in the quiet hour before dawn when the wind finally stopped howling against the eaves. He did not struggle. The fight had left him weeks ago, drained away by the stroke that had trapped him in his own body. He simply stopped breathing, a candle flickering out in a draftless room. Clara was sitting by his bedside, her hand resting on his thin, paper-dry wrist. She felt the pulse flutter and stop. There was no panic, no scream, just a profound, heavy silence that settled over the room, heavier than the snow that still blanketed the ranch. She sat there for a long time, watching the gray light of morning creep across the floorboards, realizing with a dull ache that the last link to her past, to the Hastings bloodline as it had been known, was gone. She was the matriarch now. The title felt too big for her, a coat that didn't fit. Levi found her there an hour later. He didn't speak. He saw the stillness of the old man's chest and the set of Clara's shoulders. He walked into the room, taking his hat off, and placed a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. He didn't offer platitudes. He offered presence. He stood guard while she wept, finally allowing the grief of the last terrible year to pour out of her. They buried Jedediah 3 days later, next to his wife on the small rise overlooking the creek. The ground was frozen hard as iron. Levi and Daniel had spent 2 days swinging pickaxes to carve out the grave. It was a brutal, physical labor that seemed to suit Levi's mood. He struck the earth as if he were fighting it, demanding it make room for the man who had given him a chance when no one else would. The funeral was the first sign that the tide in Laram's Point had turned. Clara had expected no one, maybe the preacher, maybe Mr. Henderson. But as she stood by the open grave, shivering in her black wool coat, she heard the sound of wagons. They came from the east and the south, the families of the valley, the Millers, the Smiths, even the widow Mrs. Gable, who had once whispered so loudly in the store. They came, bundled against the cold, standing in a respectful semicircle. They took off their hats in the freezing wind. They did not come for Jedediah alone. They came for the daughter who had nearly died fighting for her land, and for the man who had stood beside her. After the service, Mrs. Miller approached Clara. She was a young woman, barely 20, with eyes that looked bruised from lack of sleep. She held a covered dish in her hands. "I'm sorry for your loss, Clara," she said softly. Her voice caught, and I wanted to say, "I heard what you said to Nathan Hale, on the porch." Clara looked at her, surprised. The story had traveled. "I lost my first Mrs." Miller whispered, glancing down at the frozen mud. "Last winter, the town. They say things. They tell you to move on. They tell you it is God's will. But when I heard what you said, about love not being about what we produce," she looked up, tears standing in her eyes. "It gave me comfort, real comfort. Thank you." Clara felt a shift inside her. For 2 years, her pain had been a wall separating her from these people. Now, suddenly, it was a bridge. She reached out and took the woman's hand. "You are not broken. Sarah, remember that. You are not broken." The woman nodded, squeezed Clara's hand, and walked away. Clara looked at Levi, who was standing by the horses. He was watching her, a look of intense pride on his face. The week after the funeral, the rider from Cheyenne finally arrived. He carried a leather satchel and an air of official business. Clara sat at the kitchen table, the envelope in front of her. It was heavy. The seal of the territorial court was stamped in red wax. Her hands trembled. If Nathan was right, if the annulment was void, then half of this land, half of her father's grave, belonged to him. She would have to sell to pay him off. They would lose everything. "Open it," Levi said. He was standing behind her chair, his hand resting on the back of it, close enough to touch but giving her space. Clara broke the seal. She unfolded the thick, creamy paper. Her eyes scanned the dense legal script, searching for the words that mattered. Decree of annulment. Filed October 14th, 1871. Finalized and recorded. Sole property rights retained by Clara Hastings. No claim of spousal privilege. She read it twice, then 3 times. The air rushed back into her lungs. He lied, she whispered. Or he was wrong. The paperwork was filed. It was finalized before he ever remarried. He has no claim. None. The land is mine. She looked up at Levi, the paper shaking in her hand. "It's ours. He can't take it." Levi let out a breath, a long, ragged sound. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, the haunted look that had lived there since the fight in the general store was gone. "He's done," Levi said. "The bank debt is still there, but the land is safe." With the legal threat gone, they turned their faces to work, and there was so much work. But it was different now. It was not the desperate scrambling of drowning people. It was the steady, rhythmic building of a future. Spring arrived with the violence of a breaking fever. The snow melted into rushing torrents that filled the creeks to bursting. The mud was ankle deep, but the air smelled of wet earth and new sage. Levi and Daniel worked from dawn to dusk, rebuilding the barn. They didn't have the money for new timber, so they scavenged from the old structure and cut pine from the high ridge. They were a team now, the boy and the man. Levi taught Daniel not just how to work, but how to think, how to read the grain of the wood, how to leverage a beam, how to listen to the land. Clara took over the cattle. She rode Bess, her coat unbuttoned in the warming sun, checking the calves that had survived the winter. She was thin, her cheekbones sharper than they had been, but there was a color in her face that had been missing for years. She was no longer the ghost of the ranch. She was its heart. One evening in late April, Father Michaels from the mission at the reservation border rode out to the ranch. He was an old Jesuit, his face weathered like old saddle leather. He had officiated Jedediah's funeral. He sat on the porch, drinking the coffee Clara offered. "I have a favor to ask." "Clara," he said, his voice grave. "A difficult one." "Ask it, Father." "We have a child on the mission. A girl, maybe 6 years old. Her name is Lily. She was brought to us after the raid on the encampment near the Powder River last month. Her people, they are gone, scattered or killed." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the breeze. "Poor thing. She is difficult," the priest admitted. "She does not speak. She does not eat well. She hides under the beds. The sisters are trying, but the mission is crowded. She is fading. Clara, she needs a home, not an institution. She needs a mother." Clara looked out at the field where Levi was driving fence posts. She thought of the empty room down the hall. She thought of the silence in the house. She thought of her own barrenness, the label she had worn like a brand. "Bring her," Clara said. "Bring her to us." Levi was wary when she told him, "A child? Clara, we are barely standing ourselves. A child needs softness. I am not a soft man." "You were soft enough to save me," she said. "And she doesn't need softness. Levi, she needs safety. You know what it is to be alone. You know what it is to be frightened." The priest brought Lily 2 days later. She was a tiny thing, with hair the color of a raven's wing and eyes that were huge, dark, and terrified. She was dressed in a mission dress that was 2 sizes too big. She stood on the porch, clutching a rag doll, refusing to look at anyone. When Levi walked up the steps, heavy boots thudding, the girl flinched violently, shrinking back against the wall. Levi stopped. He looked at the girl. He saw the terror. He saw the way she looked at his size, his beard, his scar. He slowly took off his hat. He went down on one knee, putting himself at her eye level. He didn't smile. Smiles could be tricks. He just looked at her with his gray, serious eyes. "I know," he said. his voice a low rumble, quiet as the earth. "The world is big and loud and mean." The girl stared at him, unblinking. "But this porch," Levi continued, tapping the wood with a calloused finger. "This porch is strong, and inside there is soup and a fire, and no one will hurt you here. I will make sure of it." He stayed there, on his knees, for 5 minutes. He didn't reach for her. He let her decide, slowly, hesitantly. Lily took a step away from the wall, then another. She didn't go to Clara. She walked toward Levi. She reached out a tiny, brown hand and touched the worn leather of his vest. Levi stayed perfectly still, letting her inspect him. When she seemed satisfied that he was not a monster, she looked at Clara, then back at Levi, and gave a single, small nod. It was the beginning of a strange, beautiful family. Lily did not speak for a month. She followed Levi like a shadow. When he mended fences, she sat on the fence post, watching. When he groomed the horses, she held the brush. He spoke to her constantly, a running monologue of the ranch. "This here is a square knot. Lily holds tight, but releases easily. This is Bess. She likes to be scratched right behind the ear." Clara watched them from the window, her heart aching with a fullness she had never expected to feel. She realized then that biology was the least important part of being a parent. Being a parent was showing up. It was the daily, grinding, beautiful act of keeping something safe. One night in June, a thunderstorm rolled in, loud, crashing thunder that shook the house. Lily, who slept in a small cot in Clara's room, woke up screaming. It was a high, thin sound of absolute terror. Clara was there instantly, gathering the child into her arms. "Shh, Lily, it's just thunder. It's just noise." But Lily would not be soothed. She was thrashing, fighting a memory of a different kind of thunder, of guns and shouting. The door opened and Levi stood there, holding a lantern. He set it down and sat on the edge of the bed. "Lily," he said firmly. The girl stopped screaming, gasping for air, her eyes wide on him. "The sky is just clearing its throat," Levi said. "It's got nothing to do with you. Look at me." She looked at him. "I am here. Clara is here. Nothing gets past me." "You know that?" Lily nodded, a jerky motion. "Okay then." Levi reached out his hand. Lily took it, her small fingers disappearing into his massive palm. "I'll stay right here until the noise stops." And he did. He sat in the chair by the bed for 3 hours, holding the orphan girl's hand until the storm passed and she fell back into a dreamless sleep. The wedding was in August. It was not the grand affair Nathan Hale would have hosted. There were no carriages from Cheyenne, no silk dresses from St. Louis. It was held on the front porch of the ranch house, just as the sun was dipping behind the peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and brilliant golds. Clara wore a dress of simple blue calico, one she had sewn herself. Her hair was loose, held back by a ribbon. She held a bouquet of wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and columbine, that Lily had picked for her that morning. Levi wore his best dark shirt and a clean vest. He had trimmed his beard, though he still looked wild and rugged, a part of the landscape that had shaped him. Father Michael stood between them. Daniel stood beside Levi, grinning so hard his face looked like it might crack. Lily stood beside Clara, holding the fold of her skirt, looking serious and important. The guests were few: Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Miller and her husband, Sheriff Brody, standing in the back, hat in his hands. There were no flowery recitations. When the time came for vows, Levi took Clara's hands. His grip was warm, rough, and terrifyingly steady. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I came here with nothing. I was a man with no name worth speaking and no future worth having. You gave me a name. You gave me a place." He looked down at Lily, who was watching him with wide eyes, then back at Clara. "They told you that you were empty," he whispered. "They were blind. You are the fullest thing I have ever known. You are the harvest. You are the rain." He squeezed her hands. "I promise you my back for the work. I promise you my hands for the fight. and I promise you my heart for the rest of the days we are given. I ain't going nowhere, not ever again." Clara's vision blurred. Tears spilled over, hot and cleansing. "And I promise you, Levi Carson, that I will never hide again. I promise to stand beside you in the sun and in the snow. I promise that this house will never be cold, and you will never be alone. You are my family. You are my home. I now pronounce you man and wife," Father Michael said, smiling. Levi kissed her. It was gentle, sweet, and full of a peace that had been bought at a terrible price. The small group on the porch cheered. Daniel let out a whoop that echoed off the barn. Lily clapped her hands, a rare, bright smile breaking across her face. The celebration was a dinner at the long table in the kitchen. There was venison and fresh bread, and the brandy Mr. Henderson had brought. There was laughter in the house, loud, raucous laughter that chased the shadows from the corners. Later, after the guests had left and Daniel had taken a sleepy Lily to her bed, Clara and Levi stepped out onto the porch. The air was cooling. In the west, dark clouds were gathering again, heavy with the promise of late summer rain. The wind picked up, whipping Clara's skirt around her legs, tossing her hair. It was a storm, another one. There would always be storms. There would be debts to pay. There would be hard winters. There would be cattle that died and fences that broke. The world was not a fairy tale. It was in the west. It was hard, and it was indifferent to their happiness. But as Clara stood there, watching the lightning flash in the distance, she felt no fear. None. She felt a hand on her waist. Levi pulled her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her, resting his chin on the top of her head. "Storm's coming," he murmured. "Let it come," Clara said. She looked out at the patch of ground near the window. Earlier that spring, Levi had tilled a strip of earth there. He had scattered seeds, wild seeds he had gathered from the high meadows. Everyone said wildflowers wouldn't grow this close to the house, that the soil was too poor, the wind too harsh. But there, bending in the gale, was a riot of color. Bluebells, poppies, asters. They were wild, stubborn things. They didn't need a hothouse. They didn't need perfection. They just needed a little bit of land and the will to survive. The wind whipped through them, bending them low, but they did not break. They danced. Clara leaned back into her husband, the man who had walked through fire and ice to find her. She thought of the little girl sleeping inside, safe and claimed. She thought of the land beneath her feet, scarred and dry, but undeniably hers. She was not barren. She had never been barren. She had just been waiting for the right season and the right gardener. "We're ready," Levi whispered against her ear. "Yes," Clara said, watching the wildflowers dance in the wind. "We are." She stood tall, the mistress of the Hastings Ranch, a mother, a wife, a survivor. The storm rolled in, thunder booming like a drum. But on the porch, the three of them, the man, the woman, and the memory of the sleeping child inside, stood fast, rooted, blooming. Home. Thank you so much for journeying back to the 1870s Wyoming Territory with me. Writing Clara and Levi's story has been a deeply moving experience, exploring how love can heal the deepest wounds and how family is often something we build, not just something we are born into. I hope you enjoyed this Wild West love story. I would love to know where you are listening from. Are you tuning in from the quiet countryside, a busy city, or somewhere in between? Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story. Did Clara and Levi's journey resonate with you? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. There are many more stories to tell from the frontier, tales of grit, romance, and the enduring human spirit. Until next time, keep your fences mended and your heart open.